Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm Angela Leung, Director of the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Principal Coordinator of the collective research project called Making Modernity in East Asia, which is the organizer of today's talk. Today, we are extremely happy to have with us Victor Seow from Harvard University. He is Assistant Professor of History of Science at Harvard. He was born and raised in Singapore and received his bachelor degree in History and Political Science from McGill University and his PhD in History and East Asian Languages from Harvard University. And he was an assistant professor of history at Cornell University before he joined Harvard, the Harvard faculty in 2017. Victor Seow is a historian of technology, industry, and the environment in East Asia in the context of the modern global world. He's currently finishing his first book, Carbon Technology, Energy Regimes in Modern East Asia, which will be published by the University of Chicago Press later this year. I think we all look forward to reading this exciting book. His book explores how coal resources and mining technologies shape Chinese and Japanese experiences with global industrial modernity. The title of his talk today is Fueling Imperial Anxieties, Energy and an Empire in Interwar and Wartime Japan. After the talk, my colleague, Dr. Ghassan Moazin, who is working on the history of electricity in China, which is very close to the topic, the theme of today's talk, Dr. Ghassan Moazin will moderate the discussion. So if you have any questions during the talk or after the talk, please input your questions on the Q&A part, and Ghassan will read out the questions and will moderate the Q&A session. So, okay, let us begin. I have to mention one thing, that this is the sixth and the last MMEA, the Making Modernity in East Asia lecture in this semester. And then we will resume activities after the summer break, and you will hear from us. So without further ado, let me invite Victor Seow to speak for us.
Thank you so much, Angela. And thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ghassan, for moderating the questions, to Joan and Roy for handling the logistics, and really this exciting project, Making Modernity in East Asia, and the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences for this kind of invitation and this opportunity to share a little bit from my forthcoming book. So this is a piece of it, and I'm really honored and pleased for this chance. So the opening image I have for you over here is one of a Mokhtan Basu, and it's an example of this vehicle that would normally run on gasoline, but that's refitted with a generator where one would then put charcoal or some other biomass fuel, light it to produce gas, and then feed this gas into the engine to power the automobile. And that's what the gentleman you see standing at the back is doing right now. Now, a lot more that I could say about these producer gas vehicles, but I use this as the cover image here because I think it gestures to just a few of the things I want to talk about in terms of energy and empire today. And I'll get to these by the end. Let's see. There we go. So on the abstract for today's talk, I opened by mentioning Pearl Harbor, which is a convenient reference point to think about the intersection of energy, empire, and war. Now, it's difficult to dispute that oil was an important factor in Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought the Japanese Empire into direct conflict with the American one, ultimately leading to its defeat and collapse. Now, this story is familiar. It sort of begins with the acceleration of Japanese militarism in the 1930s, the de facto American embargo a decade later, and then Pearl Harbor that follows. And for kind of standard but really well-written account of this, you can sort of look at Daniel Lee Against the Price, or I have up here as well Miwa Munihiro's Taiheiyo Senso to Sekiyu, which is sort of an interesting take on this whole process, particularly in relation to the development of synthetic fuels. And we'll talk a little bit about one of these today in terms of shale oil. But with that, my talk really wants to sort of move away from Pearl Harbor per se to sort of locate that moment within this larger narrative of empire and energy in interwar and wartime Japan. So I have three kind of points through which I want to proceed. The first is that Japan's concerns with energy stretched back further into the past, but not that far back. So rather than it being just a sort of product of the 30s, I want to start our conversation in the aftermath of the First World War, and I'll explain why that's important. And this is in relation to the emergence of this concept of the fuel question, or the Nenryu Mondai. Second, I have over here this claim that energy and anxieties over energy, over oil certainly, but also coal, and to a lesser degree other fuel sources, were key to making and unmaking Japan's total empire, as Louise Young calls it. And here, I, especially moving into the wartime period, I want to sort of spend a little bit more time thinking about coal, which provided a large bulk of the energy that powered Japan's various enterprises in that period. And third, I want to sort of issue this provocation to think about Imperial Japan, whether in relation to whether it is sort of emblematic of, or its relationship to sort of empires of energy more broadly in the industrial modern age. And throughout the talk, I'll sort of reference the US case, which my historical actors themselves were also very cognizant of. I'll build on these points soon enough. Now, as Angela mentioned, this talk draws in part from the book that's coming out soon, hopefully at the end of this year, as of Christmas present to me and hopefully all of you. But this is Carbon Technocracy, Energy Regimes in Modern East Asia. And it's an examination of the rise of two things concurrently. On the one hand, both the idea and practices of fossil fuel development, and on the other hand, the technocratic state and technocratic governance in China and Japan, and explore this in the first half of the 20th century. The centerpiece of this story, and I'll touch on this place, and we'll visit it on sort of a few instances in the talk, is as marked on the map. This is the Fushun Colliery in southern Manchuria. For much of this period, it boasted the largest coal mining operations in East Asia, or Asia actually, writ large. It changed hands between multiple regimes, Chinese and Japanese, and for that reason allows for, I argue, a very nice sort of connected yet comparative story about these energy regimes and the place of sort of energy in the political economy of China and Japan. The key concept, and this is the title of the book itself, is carbon technocracy, which I see as well exemplified through this particular mine as a metaphor. And there are three features I would highlight, and this also you would see at certain points through the talk today. So the first thing is sort of the embrace of techno-scientific measures to master the energy resources deemed essential to national wealth and power. The second is the continued reliance on labor in escalating efforts at extraction in spite of a pursuit of mechanization. So while there was a push to sort of replace human beings with mechanized forms of extraction, what we in fact see here and elsewhere is a deepening dependence on human energy as well. And that's one of the major sort of points of the book. And lastly, is this belief in the limitlessness of energy resources, or if not nationally, or specific to a site, then globally. And these are terms that Fushun is oftentimes referred to as this treasure house that cannot be exhausted, or this limitless site of extraction. And this is a theme that comes up as well in my and in the workings, as I see, of carbon technocracy across these various regimes. In terms of a roadmap for what then follows, just to point out, there's also a little sort of progress bar at the bottom, so you can sort of follow where we are in the talk as well. There are three main sort of sections I would like to go through. First, we'll look at the emergence of the fuel question, the Nenryo Mondai in interwar Japan, 2 decades prior to Pearl Harbor, and we'll understand this as concerning not only oil, but also coal, and to a lesser degree, other forms of fuel. Second, we'll survey a range of solutions that Japanese planners, scientists, engineers, and industrialists pursued in response to this fuel question. And our main actor here will be the Fuel Society of Japan, the Nenryo Kyokai, which was an organization that brought together folks from across these various sectors, and which, in searching for solutions to the fuel question, came to constitute it, as I argue. And third, we'll then turn to the wartime era, in which we witness what I term a Lawscape of Intensification, which is an assemblage put together in part to secure more energy that ended up requiring increasing volumes of energy to sustain. So with that, let's jump into the emergence of the fuel question. The fuel question, of which, as I stated from the start, Pearl Harbor was arguably one solution, arose at least 20 years prior, right after the First World War. There were, of course, antecedents to these concerns over the securing of fuel. One good example, I think, is right before the Russo-Japanese War. Japanese naval planners were really worried that they didn't have enough suitable naval coal, and although they would eventually secure sufficient supplies of this from Cardiff following the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and then go on to win the war and make their mark further make their mark on the region. But the fuel question that emerged after World War I distinguished itself not so much by pinpointing a problem specific to a situation, such as securing adequate fuel supplies before an imminent war, as by naming a condition with which Japan was presumed afflicted. The fuel question also rose alongside other questions in the late 19th and early 20th century in Japan, like the women's question, the social question, and these were questions that represented efforts to grapple with both changes in Japanese society and Japan's place in a changing world. Now, there's also a global dimension to posing questions in this way. Historian Holly Case has pronounced the long 19th century the quote-unquote age of questions. And she argues that this period witnessed the question emerging in Europe and the United States as, quote, an instrument of thought with special potency, structuring ideas about society, politics, and states, and influencing the range of actions considered possible and desirable. Those who wielded this instrument, I argue, used it to etch images of envisioned futures onto the present. And so too was it with the fuel question in Japan. Its interlocutors raised it not merely to express dismay over yet another measure by which Japan might be deemed inferior to the Western powers. They also did so to give weight to the issue of fuel scarcity and lend credence to the accompanying prescriptions, which, in addressing the problem, promised to ensure the empire's continued advancement. Now, the fuel question first began taking shape through concerns over petroleum after World War I, as the war made dreadfully clear how indispensable that liquid fuel was to warfare, over land or on and under the waters or in the air. These devices, these vehicles that were powered by petroleum, gave combatants an unprecedented range of speed and mobility, and in so doing, they redefined the terms of battle. Now, Japanese promoters of petroleum's strategic significance would, for instance, insist that Germany's loss had largely resulted from shortages of this vital resource, often pairing this claim with French statesman Georges Clemenceau's memorable and much quoted assertion that, quote, "A drop of oil is worth a drop of blood." And in fact, I believe in front of the Nippon Oil, which is the main oil producer at the gates, there's this quote was included sort of in the aftermath in the 1920s. Now, the Imperial Japanese Navy was to take this lesson to heart, and it had actually first outfitted a destroyer with oil-fueled boilers in the midst of the war in 1915, before subsequently moving to convert its entire fleet to run on this fuel. Now, why oil? Well, some advantages would include its higher calorific value that allowed for greater speed. And that one was sort of a prominent factor that's often pronounced. But in addition to that, it was also the way in which it could be loaded by pipes rather than workers, which saved time and labor. And there was also this issue of having a cleaner combustion, which gave off less technically compromising black smoke. Now, the Navy's shift to oil coincided with, and may in fact have been hastened by, restrictions on its fleet expansion. In 1922, the world's leading naval powers, the three naval powers, the US, Britain, and Japan, agreed by treaty, and sort of as seen from this cartoon here, to contain the size of their fleets so as to forestall the arms race that had been brewing amongst them. So under the final terms, Japan was allowed 60% of American and British allotments, and this is quite common knowledge. But one interesting thing about this here is that while it was to put an end to a long-standing dream that naval planners had of an enlarged fleet that was backboned by the so-called 8-8 fleet plan, backboned by 8 dreadnoughts and 8 armored cruisers, naval planners soon pivoted to trying to work around these imposed constraints by expanding the operational capacities of their fleets. And this was and sort of installing oil-burning boilers across its vessels was one means to this end. And by the end of that decade, by 1929, the Japanese fleet was almost completely powered by oil. But oil and coal and other energy sources would also escalate across the 1920s, this sort of interwar increase in appetites for energy. And this table that you can see over here comes from a 1935 US government report on these sort of escalating demands in Japan. But one thing that I wanted to point out here that I thought was quite interesting, and this is in relation to coal, is that you see, at least across the 1920s, an increased, leading up to the Depression, that you do see sort of an escalating amount of increase in coal consumption. And this is in spite of the economic downturn of the early 1920s, following the wartime boom. There was that post-war slump. One explanation given by chemist and coal expert Naito Yu then was that this was an issue of thermal inefficiency. As the economy started to stagnate, factories that used to run day and night, something that started to get accustomed to in the midst of the wartime boom, began limiting their operations to daylight hours. The result, he explained, was that steam boilers on site left to rest at night lost most of their heat and so needed more coal to fire them up the next day. And Naito and other fuel researchers would fight a seemingly ceaseless war against such waste, this kind of thermal inefficiency. for coal, even as coal consumption alongside that of other fuels continued to swell. Now, the fuel question was about more than this kind of deepening dependency on energy, though. It was also informed by notions of autarky on the one hand and acts of comparison on the other. Japanese military planners became fixated with the issue of autarky or self-sufficiency during the war. And I think one of the best accounts of this still remains Michael Bernhardt's book, Japan Prepares for Total War, in which Bernhardt traces how the protracted fighting in the Great War, typified above all by the trench, challenged Japanese officers to rethink the conduct of war and appreciate the centrality of self-sufficiency. Now, this turned out to be a lesson well learned by most countries, whether or not they were directly involved in the fighting, particularly as blockades and the wartime commandeering of shipping put many of them under some degree of de facto autarky. Now, the desire for energy self-sufficiency that underlay the fuel question was further propelled by the sense that Japan was far from this goal, often emphasized in comparison with other countries. And here we have, this is a postcard from 1920 showing iron, coal, and oil production, and then the number of sort of automotives as well, these trucks. And the 5 countries being represented from left to right, being Britain, America, Japan, France, and then Germany. And Japan's poor showing here, you see the sort of smallest factory, which is supposed to sort of represent iron production, or smallest stack of coal production, and this nearly sort of this really sort of minuscule, almost can't be seen truck with it's representing this automotive capacity and also the small amount of oil production. So its poor showing here, as it's dwarfed by other powers, contributed to a wider discourse of Japan as a have-not country, this idea of the Motazaru Kuni. And for more on this, I think sort of situate this within the sort of larger basket of resources. You can, I highly recommend Sato Jin's thoughtful treatment in Motazaru Kuni no Shigenron, which I have this for you for there as well. But amidst all of this, they have much discussion of the fuel question in these times. I wanted to share some reflections by this figure over here, someone I've paid much attention to, Yoshimura Manji, who was the inaugural head of the Fuel Society of Japan. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Fuel Society shortly, but I've picked Yoshimura because what he says is really quite interesting, and also because his position at the center of this important institution. And he says quite a number of things, but one of the most interesting things I think he raises is the way he talks about the relationship between oil and coal. Now, this piece comes from 1922, and it's actually the first issue of the Fuel Society, and this is his opening words. And early in the piece, he proclaims that the solid fuel age is passing and the world is entering the liquid fuel age. Now, this idea of this coal transitioning to oil is quite a common one. Yet later on in the very same piece, he argues that coal will be the primary fuel of the future. As he saw it, this was a matter of output and reserves. The global annual production of petroleum then was around 600 million barrels, which amounted to, he pointed out, about 100 million tons of coal. Coal output exceeded that by more than tenfold at roughly 1.3 to 1.4 billion tons per year. Furthermore, he asserted that while calculations of deposits might differ, there was little doubt that the volume of coal reserves worldwide and hence their longevity were, quote, by far greater than that of petroleum. Now, in addition, there was the prospect of coal directly substituting for petroleum. With limited access to petroleum that powered the many machines now running on liquid fuels, countries like Japan should develop alternatives, Yoshimura advised, with one promising possibility being the liquefying of coal through low-temperature carbonization. The persistence of these quote-unquote older sources of power across energy transitions may be a given. After all, in our world today, we still burn a ton of coal. But the way in which these sources were sometimes repurposed in new forms, as we have in sort of coal liquefaction, is worth noting. And this is something that Japan takes up, especially in the late 30s into the war into the 40s. At the same time, Yoshimura had read William Stanley Javins's 1865 Coal Question and shared the British economist's reservations about the long-term sustainability of coal-fired growth. He accepted the book's premise, namely that Britain's strength was predicated on cheap coal, which had allowed it to produce cheap iron, then cheap machines, and finally cheap commodities for export. But he also accepted its central concern, which is that once all the easily mined deposits were dug out, even if coal still remained in the ground, it would become increasingly more costly to extract, as was already the case in Japan. To aggravate matters, coal was, Yoshimura stressed, quote, a thing without hope of regeneration, with a rate of consumption that was quickly going up. Hence, even though the availability of this resource was not a problem at present, it soon would be. Given global estimates, which, for example, placed Japan's coal reserves at 0.2% those of the United States and about 1% those of China, quote, it is not difficult to imagine that our country will exhaust its coal much faster than the US, China, and other countries, he warned. Now, if coal were to be the primary fuel of the future, as he had suggested, then Japan's future looked rather bleak indeed. Now, by the end of the 1920s, the fuel question became an issue of widespread interest across Japan, and this reflected a broader set of concerns surrounding not only sort of ongoing shortages, or especially relative to other countries, but as what Yoshimura had suggested, anticipated ones as well. These anticipated shortages in domestic sources of energy. Now, while different commentators often understood the fuel question differently in terms of what it entailed and how it should be addressed, the suggestion that Japan faced an energy crisis went basically unchallenged. Which then brings me to the fuel society. You have, in response to the fuel question, multiple public and private organizations forming or redirecting their efforts towards the fuel question and alleviating it. And one such organization was the Fuel Research Institute. It's building in Saitama, and it was established by the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce in 1921. Now, the Fuel Society, the Nenryo Kyokai, began a year later, and it brought together individuals from both public and private spheres who either conducted research on fuels or were otherwise involved or invested in the energy sector. Early on, one commentator spoke of the society's work in terms of the so-called ethical burdens of expertise. And the quote, when a moving train is about to cross over a broken bridge, it is incumbent upon those passing by as people near to the train to endeavor to save it. As those who are very close to our country's fuel question, we should alert our compatriots to the current danger and work to mitigate the fuel situation for the sake of our national livelihood. End quote. Now, operating with this deep sense of urgency, the society inadvertently further fueled such anxieties in the process. Now, what exactly did it do? There are a couple of things that I'll sort of touch on here. One being sort of promotion of policy. The other, which is its kind of main work, was around public outreach. And then the pursuit of other sort of solutions, and primarily through the conservation of fuel and the discovery of alternative sources. So in relation to fuel policy, this was largely an effort to kind of secure funding from the government, but also help with funding to support extractive prospecting and extractive endeavors, but also assistance in securing foreign concessions. Now, behind the various provisions that fuel policy advocates would put forward was the conviction that Japan actually needed access to increasing amounts of fossil fuels. Without doubt that there were some, namely local producers, who sought to protect their profitability with restrictions on output or imports, And I'll be glad to sort of answer this in the Q&A, because it's a pretty interesting story in which you have Japanese coal producers pushing back against the import of Fushun coal. This is a sort of a notable instance in the early 1930s, and I can say a little bit more about this. But aside from while there were these folks who were kind of resistant to this idea of more fossil fuels circulating around sort of Japanese society and Japanese markets, most of those who called for a fuel policy, and certainly those from the fuel society, wanted more carbon resources out of the ground and in Japanese hands, including carbon resources that lay beneath foreign soils. Now, we may assume that this kind of dynamic of expansion for extraction to be quite a natural interplay between empire and energy, until we consider that to other imperial powers like the US and Britain, which were engaged in the contest for Middle Eastern oil during this period, controlling petroleum was actually less about producing escalating quantities than about limiting output, and thus maximizing profits for national firms amid the worldwide glut of the late 1920s. Japan was, in contrast, all too aware of its comparative poverty in these resources, as in other endowments, and it would seem just could not get enough of that stuff. In terms of public outreach, this would be the society's main function. Like many good sort of research institutes, it hosted and it organized and hosted a whole host of lectures, of seminars, of roundtables, but in addition to that, there was this exhibition here in 1930 that I wanted to spotlight, held in Tokyo, that tried to educate attendees about a whole host of matters relating to fuels. They sort of put on display sort of novel fuels such as artificial charcoal that burned without ash, or synthetic petroleum made from fish oil, to new appliances such as coal-saving boilers, stoves, and kettles. At this 10-day-long event that was held at the Ministry of in Marunouchi in central Tokyo, you also had a series of lectures, film screenings, distributed pamphlets, and about 40,000 people would come and sort of take part and see the exhibits in this exhibition. And its organizers would hence sort of declare it, quote, unimaginably successful. Now, whether one accepts their self-congratulation, it's hard to deny that the Fuel Society did more than any other entity to make the fuel question a public concern, as it worked to condition the Japanese populace to crave fossil fuels and fear energy shortages. Now, one thing that was sort of interesting that I wanted to sort of foreground here too is that in 1925, the society, continuing in this sort of interest of fostering public engagement, held an essay contest, and the prompt was to write a piece, quote, to inform the general public of important issues concerning the fuel question. Now, the winner was picked out from 40 submissions, and it was the individual was an army officer, Nagai Mosaburo. What's interesting that he is reading his essay, he had sort of contended that, quote, natural resources are gifts bestowed upon humankind by heaven, and hence access to them should be open to all countries under principles of, quote, coexistence and co-prosperity within international community. He argued that, quote, while it may be unjust for resource-poor countries to invade countries with resource abundance, it was also unjust for resource-rich countries to deny other countries access to their resources. By this logic, forcing oneself in to secure fuel rights may be defensible on ethical grounds, he concluded. And the representative case he had in mind was the United States, who, quote, having arrived late to the struggle for oil in the Middle East, was now, quote, crying for equal opportunities and the open door. The Japanese empire, it seemed, had something to learn from the American one. Now, for many experts, one solution to the fuel problem was to use less of it. They were, I should stress though, not talking about scaling back the industrial and other activities that consumed coal, petroleum, and other sources of energy. Rather, what they were speaking of, they would speak of this in terms such as reducing the sacrifice of fuels, and so as to allow small amounts of fuel to burn completely and to give off greater heat to support existing and expanding applications. So in other words, this was an issue about increasing efficiency along with increased use, not so much a sort of efficiency that's accompanied by a scaling back of use. The long-term goal here was still one of expansion and growth. Now, the first major attempt at applying fuel conservation to industry would take place in Osaka in the late 1920s. As historian Kobori Satoru contends in his study of trans-war Japan's energy revolution, this was a key episode in, quote, the birth of energy conservation policy. And I have here his book that I highly recommend, Nihon no Energy Kakume. Now, what we have in the backdrop here is Osaka, which is where this happens. Pre-war Japan's industrial heart. It was also sort of nicknamed the Manchester of the East or the Manchester of the Orient, but concurrently also held the title, the sort of unofficial title of capital of smoke. Now, a number of concerned citizens had over the years tried and failed to have a smoke abatement ordinance put in place. And they kept being sort of beaten back by industry leaders who were very much turned off by the costs that would have been involved, because this involved the introduction of emissions reducing devices. Now, only after Osaka's prefectural government worked with fuel society representatives to make a case to industry leaders that equated smoke prevention to fuel efficiency, in which you have, a more complete combustion leading to less fuel use and less particulate matter released, was this regulation then passed. But beyond industry, fuel conservation also made its way into the household. As Oshima Yoshikio, then Fuel Society president, he takes over after Yoshimura Manji, remarks in 1926, quote, domestic fuel consumption may seem small for individual households, but were we to regard the cumulative total for the whole country, it is not something to sneeze at. Which is to say, this idea of multiple units, or the mass of these household units being able to, in its aggregate, make a real difference. For instance, the home thus then also became a site for these kinds of machinations. You have a fuel society lecture over here, the script from that, the paper that was published from that, on cooking and fuel by Japan Women's University professor Wakahara Tomiko, who employed similes that recalled Clemenceau's likening of oil to blood, and when she declared, a piece of coal is like a slice of bread, a drop of oil like a cup of drinking water, before proceeding to lay out ways to save fuel at home, beginning with the cooking of rice. In both factory and domicile, then, fuel conservation was touted as a way to get more out of the energy resources available to Japan. What differentiated the two was that when fuel truly became scarce, as it was the home and not the mill that was treated as the primary site of sacrifice, where women and men were asked not just to burn fuel efficiently, but at times to forego burning it altogether. State policies should come before personal interests, Wakahara insisted. And these became painfully so clear with the squeeze of the wartime era. Another sort of solution that was put forward at that time was the development of alternative fuels, and amongst these, none would be as significant as shale oil that was sort of developed and produced in Fushun. Now, shale oil is a liquid hydrocarbon that's distilled from the insoluble organic material that's contained within the finely textured sedimentary rock called oil shale. To the delight of many Japanese imperialists, a huge deposit of this rock sat atop Fushun's thick coal seam. according to Akibane Katsumi, who worked for Mantetsu, this was nothing less than, quote, good news from heaven, for the estimated 5.5 billion tons of Fushun oil shale might yield over 2 billion barrels of oil, which he noted was about a fifth of the reserves of the petroleum-rich US and enough to meet Japanese demand for 300 years, he claimed. Now, oil shale had actually been discovered much earlier. It was in Fushun in 1909, although tests that Mantetsu chemists had initially conducted suggested a pretty low yield. And while company chemists continued to run tests over the years that followed, nothing immediate came out of it. With the emergence of the fuel question, however, there was a renewed interest in the prospect of shale oil, and the Navy would work together with Mantetsu to bring this enterprise into being. Something that should be noted that helped make worthwhile, or at least more worthwhile, more feasible this enterprise was that in the teens into the 1920s, Mantetsu started sort of large-scale development of open-pit mining in Fushun, and this would be Japan's first open-pit mine. There wasn't anything of that sort in the home islands, and by the early 1930s, the amount of stuff that's removed, overburdened, removed to excavate this mine and to get to the coal seams beneath was already like 3 times the amount of stuff that was removed to excavate the Panama Canal. So just give you a sense of how large this operation was. But because of this, the overburden was already removed, and so including the oil shale, and so these proponents for the shale oil industry will oftentimes talk about it as almost free of charge. Since they were to be excavated as tailings to begin with. But in spite of that, the military and the government would pour lots of capital to bringing this industry into being. Even as Mantetsu chemists studying German and Scottish model methods of shale oil distillation then developed their own methods that were suited for the far lower melting point of Fushun oil shale. Now, there was a lot of excitement about shale oil. I can talk a little bit more about the process by which this industry came together, but the main thing that I wanted to point out in relation to this is this sense of the silver bullet solution, this idea that shale oil, granted that Fushun's shale oil planted its establishment in 1929 was the world's largest shale oil facility, it still would not sort of provide that silver bullet solution that those who, for instance, said that would be a godsend to Japan to head off fuel famine or could last 300 years would pronounce. For if the prime objective of launching Fushun's shale oil industry had been Japan's energy self-sufficiency, then the outcome came up short. For even when Fushun shale oil made up a fourth of the Japanese Empire's petroleum production in 1940, more than 60% of the petroleum Japan consumed that year was imported. And so that Fushun shale oil would serve as anything approaching what one hopeful commentator termed the axle of Japan's fuel supply turned out to be a pipe dream. I realized that I'm going a little bit slower than I had practiced, and so I will skip ahead over here. I think there's something, love to maybe mention this point later, but I think there's something about sort of shale oil itself that exemplifies both reflects and reproduces Japanese imperialism. So I'll return to that point if in the Q&A if folks are interested. But over here is Goto Shinbe, who's familiar to many folks. He's the doctor turned colonial bureaucrat, the first president of Mantetsu, wearer of many ministerial hats, and also one-time mayor of Tokyo. And in 1925, the Fuel Society invites him to give a lecture on the fuel problem. And he, in his lecture, he recognized that while there was great advances being made in applying science to the utilization of calories, as he saw it, because there were limits to maximizing energy efficiency. There were limits to maximizing energy efficiency because even under the best circumstances, and as much as 80% of calories were still wasted in combustion. And because of this, economizing practices alone were insufficient to solve the country's fuel question. What was needed instead, he suggested, was for Japan to leverage its advancement in science to acquire and use coal and petroleum in countries where such treasures lay abundant but largely untapped by cooperating with one another under coexistence and co-prosperity. As he saw it, Japan had the science but not the energy resources, while these countries had the energy resources but not the science. Thus, Japan should supply the science in those countries the resources to their mutual benefit. Such was, quote, the mission of the Yamato race, he concluded. Now, in light of Japan's turn to hyper-militarism in the 1930s, it may be easy for us to read Goto's charge as part of an overture to later expansionist acts, especially when we consider how the co-prosperity he evoked would be mobilized by the Japanese wartime state as an ideal to justify its seizure of territories across Asia. To do so, though, may be over-determining that outcome. Not every word or deed in the 1920s needs to be taken as foreshadowing the decade that followed. And yet there was something unmistakably imperialist about how Goto discussing harnessing science to gain control of resources abroad. This, however, did not necessarily stem from the particularities of the Japanese experience. In the post-World War I era, all major imperial powers would in fact be invested in securing foreign petroleum reserves. This included the United States, which was greatly admired by Japanese fuel experts. Many of them envied the American abundance of coal and petroleum, as I pointed out in sort of the previous examples. The United States was repeatedly made to stand in contrast to Japan and its comparative dearth in fossil fuels. And some of these experts, such as Fuel Society Essay Contest winner Nagai Mosaburo, extolled the American audacity at muscling into the competition among empires for petroleum overseas as a latecomer to the global scramble of oil. Now, recent works in the history of the US and the world, and here I'm thinking of folks like Daniel Immerwahr or Megan Black, they have reminded us that the United States has been and remains an empire. What I want to point out is that to Japanese observers in the 1920s, there was little doubt that it was. To suggest then that Japan may have been taking notes on how the US and other Western imperial powers made efforts to lay claim to energy resources beyond their borders does not, however, absolve the Japanese Empire or Japanese empire builders from attempting to do the same, nor should it imply that Japanese imperialism was entirely derivative or inexorable. Nevertheless, it does allow us to situate Japan among the multiple empires jostling for mastery of energy in the carbon age. And this brings us to the question of the relationship between energy and empire. As necessary as coal was to Japan's emergence as an imperial power, is not for control of carbon, at least initially, that the Meiji state extended itself beyond the archipelago. Japan had, after all, arrived in Fushun first, and other parts where it mined coal. Only upon determining the site's wealth of coal did it start to set up the immense social and technological assemblage with which it plundered this resource. As Japan consolidated its empire and continued its industrial expansion in the years that followed, it became ever more dependent on fossil fuels in the form of coal and later petroleum too. And at that juncture, the existing empire served as a source not only for greater volumes of energy resources than before, but over time also the alternative liquid fuels that were shale oil and subsequently liquefied coal. When these were deemed insufficient to feed its growing appetite for energy, Japan would look to accessing resources in other areas too. Now, it may be that the Japanese were increasingly interested in acquiring foreign mining concessions in the 1920s amid the anxieties of the fuel question, had indeed assumed that consent for the extractive endeavors might be secured from locals without the application of force, as Goto had suggested. Yet given the turn to, quote, a new celebration of military action and aesthetics of violence, which historian Louis Young regards as central to the fascist imperialism that took root in Japan after the Mukden incident, most of them probably recognized that such concessions required coercion to capture. For example, returning to Yoshimura Manji, although now 15 years later, Yoshimura Manji would write in 1936 that Japan should take into its hands, quote, China's several hundred million tons of coal resources that, against the spirit of the modern world, it's completely unused at present and hoarded away in vain. Now, when he said this, it's really difficult, at least for me to believe, that he would have really imagined this happening without the Chinese first staring down the barrel of a Japanese gun. Now, I'm running short of time, and so I'll skip over quite a fair bit in the end. I'll maybe go over some of the main points here in regard to just this escalation of what I call a warscape of intensification, in which we see and this is a play on Christopher Jones, the sort of energy historian Christopher Jones's idea of landscape of intensification, where we see these forms of socio-technical infrastructures like canals, pipelines, and wires marked by a synergistic feedback loops through which they simulated and sustained ever-increasing consumption of coal, oil, and electricity. And so we have at least, so in terms of the warscape of intensification, the main argument here is that as Japan expanded to secure for itself greater energy resources, not only in terms of petroleum, but also coal, that it required increasing amounts of energy to sustain, and also exposed itself to greater vulnerabilities as the threats of transport lines and the disruption of transport lines also meant sort of pulling the plug on certain industries around the empire. So to skip ahead a bit, I mean, the one main point I would say here is that the Japanese metropole would increasingly become dependent on its empire by 1940, in part due to the sort of shortages of labor and of materials to sustain the escalation of production in the home islands, which peaks in 1940 at 57 million tons or so. And we see a sort of a problem emerging here with a decline in mining efficiency as well, in terms of average output of miner per year, as the sort of conditions for mining become sort of deteriorate, and miners themselves too you have more and more less experienced people being conscripted or being drawn to work in the mines, even as more experienced miners are sometimes conscripted by the military and the like. But within the empire, these we also sort of see challenges in terms of the shortages of labor, expertise, and equipment. And part of the sort of irony here, at least in regard to equipment, is that with the greater sort of mechanization of operations, which was in part an effort to cut down on a reliance of labor and sort of the vulnerability of these mines to things like strikes and worker action, new sorts of vulnerabilities emerged. And this was largely in terms of the sort of equipment that could not be maintained, or the inability to receive replacement parts from the home islands because of disrupted transportation lines and the like. And you see sort of systematic shortages that were of materials and men that were compounded by calamitous episodes that further crippled production. And the one thing maybe that I would sort of mention here at least in relation to the empire, is in the midst of these shortages, and we see squeezes on multiple fronts. But but one area which was definitely labor as well, and in Manchuria, in Fushun and other areas within it, these would be the sort of conscription or the use of quote unquote special workers, guided workers, euphemisms for these forced laborers. According to one calculation, around there were about 40,000 special workers who would labor, in many cases die in Fushun itself by the end of the war. And it was not alone in the use of forced labor in other industrial enterprises, from Fuxin to, let's say, Beipiao, Xi'an, and Xihu. The Showa Steelworks in Anshan also employed these special workers. And we also see this back in the home islands, especially with the use of Korean forced labor, and one figure that I can give you here on this front is in 1941, about 17% of coal miners in Japan were Korean, and to a lesser extent other non-Japanese. And by 1945, this proportion would increase to 36%. And these special workers, at least I'll just maybe say a few things about the conditions under which they worked here in Fushun, because it gives you at least a sense of at least the treatment of this forced labor, which I think it's at least important to stress. They had several sort of regulatory mechanisms that had been set up to manage ordinary workers. In earlier times, had adapted well to this climate of more merciless control. The special workers would be processed in some sense like regular ones, fingerprints taken, ID cards made. But whereas the interest before had been to monitor worker mobility, the intention here was in completely restricting that mobility, preventing these special workers from running away. As to why they would flee, there was sort of little wonder why. They was forced to work for more than 10 hours a day, fed poorly, usually on acorn flour. Many of them wasted away. Illness and disease were rampant, becoming challenges that Japanese officials tried to keep in check through means often harsh and cruel. At stake, after all, was a potential blow to the productivity they so cherished. Wang Keming, a former special worker in Fushun, recalled that when he came to Fushun late in the summer of 1941, he was first taken to get, quote, disinfected. And he says over here, he clarifies, getting disinfected was not the same as being given a shower, but was having one's body sprayed with a kind of acidic substance with fumes that, when inhaled, caused one to choke and shed tears. According to Wang, Japanese authorities went to the most extreme lengths to contain any possible spread of infectious diseases. If they found anyone who had contracted an infectious disease, they would douse them in oil and burn them alive. Because diarrhea was regarded as a sign of infectious disease, when Wang or his compatriots had loose stools, they would quickly cover up their waste with soil to avoid being discovered and killed. Now, historian of medicine Warwick Anderson has termed the fixation on fecal management in colonial public health regimes excremental colonialism. Here, Wang and other special workers found themselves having to try to outmaneuver excremental colonialism taken to its most odious extreme. Later, a doctor who came from the metropolitan capital of Shinkyo to survey conditions at the colliery would diagnose these bouts of diarrhea as having resulted from severe malnutrition and not an infectious disease. Now, it's perhaps impossible to truly quantify how much squeezing labor out of these workers, both special and regular at Fushun and other mines in Manchuria and beyond, may have contributed to productivity. If it did, such measures were sorely inadequate. Coal output continued to decline in Manchuria as it did in the rest of the Japanese Empire. And as the war dragged on, pre-existing problems only got worse and worker shortages persisted despite the use of forced labor. So, I mean, one of the main points, again, I can elaborate on this later too, is the disruption of energy flows and transportation lines through the Allied blockades, which not only affected the shipment of these resources around, from the colonies to the metropole. For instance, one way in which they tried to, Japanese planners tried to avoid this was to move more North Chinese and Manchurian coal through Korea instead. So they shipped them by rail and then had a shorter distance to travel rather than, risking it by sending them from Dalian or from other ports further in, where they would be maybe exposed to Allied firepower. So it wasn't only in regard to this sort of colony to metropole, but within the Japanese islands as well. And so one result of this is by July 1945, the available coal in Japan was almost half of its wartime peak, and the war machine would start to grind to a halt even before the dropping of the bombs a few months later. Now, I had said that I picked by way of conclusion, I have two things I want to say. One is in regard to my opening image of the Mokutansha, of the charcoal powered car, which I said is kind of which gestures in part to this dynamic between empire and energy, and one can talk about it in terms of its inefficiencies on the one hand, or its resourcefulness on the other. But I bring this to the forefront in part because of its oftentimes civilian applications and to its the widespread use in the colonies, and in which we see sort of individuals sacrifice for status objectives. So largely in terms of these were vehicles because the petroleum or oil was being requisitioned for military use. You had sort of these civilian vehicles, and especially in the colonies and occupied areas, repurposed and refitted with this device, in which and this was very pronounced with the colonies sacrificing for the metropole. So that's one reason why I sort of put the Mokutansha here, although I'll be interested to sort of talk to folks about this and see what your thoughts may be on how this sort of technology may be representative of this larger enterprise. But I wanted to end with this because I thought it's an interesting kind of report that came out in 1947. And this is by the US Strategic Bombing Survey, and which formed right before the war ended in 1944. It was to investigate the impact of American aerial bombardment of Germany, so as to provide findings to assess air power and its future development. And after it would subsequently extend its scope of research to Japan and the Pacific after the war wrapped up. Now, the researchers concluded that coal had a more important role in the Japanese war economy than earlier recognized, but because the sites of extraction were dispersed, attacking those sites directly would not have been practical. That said, the transportation lines through which Japan's energy resources traveled had been extremely vulnerable. Therefore, the researchers reasoned while the blockade was effective, a concentrated bombing campaign on sea and rail routes would have further hit these supplies and paralyzed Japan's industrial activity. Now, in their survey of efforts at mining coal across the Japanese empire, the American researchers detailed the constellation of difficulties that compounded one another and undermined the entire extractive enterprise. At the same time, though, they seemed all too ready to relate to the underlying logic that drove the venture. And this is what interested me. And so I quote over here. says coal resources in Karafuto, Korea, Manchukuo, and North China were enormous, and the pre-war production of each region was capable of a substantial expansion. Had they been given freedom from hostile interference and sabotage labor and necessary equipment and materials, and sufficient transport from mine to port and thence to consumers in Japan proper, the Japanese would have had an almost unlimited supply of coal for the taking. It is small wonder that they succumbed to that lure as an attractive alternative to the harsh and unpopular measures which would have been required to squeeze the maximum of production from their domestic resources, particularly in view of their inescapable dependence on imported coking coal. Now, that these American researchers too would appreciate the quote-unquote lure of these almost unlimited supply of coal for the taking points to the wider reach of carbon technocracy, for which idealizing endless energy was central. This is perhaps not surprising, given how entrenched the prodigious consumption of coal was in developmentalist notions of progress across industrial societies. What is slightly startling is the researchers' suggestion that this supposedly unlimited supply would have been for the taking if this broad range of conditions, including freedom from wartime disruptions, were met. Such a hypothetical disregards the fact that, quote-unquote, hostile interference and sabotage were responses to Japan's extractive endeavors that required increasing amounts of energy to support an empire built in part on the very premise of securing such power. In many ways, this warscape of intensification that took shape under Japanese imperial leadership exposed the vulnerabilities of carbon technocracy, pushing the energy regime to consume itself in terms of both carbon and human resources more quickly than it could produce. Furthermore, the colonial coal from Manchuria and elsewhere could never truly be free for the taking, as the American researchers suggested. It was, after all, mined through the ruthless exploitation of Chinese, Korean, and other non-Japanese labor upon whom measures deemed, quote-unquote, harsh and unpopular for Japanese miners were readily inflicted. So thank you for listening. Sorry for the truncation halfway, but I hope to fill whatever gaps may have emerged through the Q&A and through any other questions you have. Thank you for your time, and thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victor, for that fascinating talk, and I think that lets us all look forward even more to your forthcoming book. I think we already have our first few questions, so I think we should probably dive right in. The first question comes from Rohit Chandra. The question is, what is the relationship between isolation, both commercial and diplomatic, of countries and energy innovation? Whether it is Imperial Japan, post-World War I Germany, the Fischer-Tropsch process, or apartheid South Africa, Seow. There's something interesting about isolationist pressures and the ability to motivate your engineers and technocracy to come up with new energy and chemical process solutions. And he would love to hear your theories on how these pressures transmit to innovative moments in technocracies.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks so much, Rohit. It's good to see you again and reconnect through this venue. I think, so isolationist pressures is definitely, it's one way to frame it. I think the way I've framed it, at least in this paper so far, is in terms of sort of autarkic thinking instead. And I mean, overlap not necessarily the same thing. I mean, I think autarky can be autarky and self-sufficiency definitely becomes necessary in sort of an isolationist frame. But then in the case of Japan, it pushes it to its sort of inspires also kind of more sort of expansionist endeavors on the continent and elsewhere. And in that vein, it was actually these Japanese scientists and chemists and engineers were very much in touch with these, or at least with Germany, post-World War I Germany, in developing some of these processes. They sort of bought a patent for Fischer-Tropsch, for instance, but were also sending shale oil samples and coal samples from various parts of the empire to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for, and so which in itself is kind of interesting, right? It's this like network of, I mean, it's now somewhat common to think about or it's becoming more common to think about, you know, comparative fascisms and the connected fascisms, and which many of which were predicated on autarkic thinking. And we see this very well in Tiago Saraiva's work, for instance, compares Italy, Spain, and Nazi Germany. But then there was also that kind of network amongst among these sort of autarkic regimes, which seems to run counter to that kind of more sort of the isolationist mode. I mean, if taken to the most literal sense, but yeah, I'll be thinking with your question for a while in terms of that tension between maybe isolation and autarky, and its meaning for innovation. Because at least in the case that I study here in the interwar period, it's sort of connected for an isolationist purpose, for an autarkic purpose. And maybe this is just the nature of which through which, you know, this techno-scientific developments are advanced, at least in this area. Thank you. And I'd love to, yeah. Oh,
you know,
thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from our colleague at HKU, James Victor, who asks, how does the shift to oil for naval and broadly army and air combat use change the fuel equation for the Japanese army and navy? Specifically, when coal was the main fuel for the navy, it had to compete for coal with many other uses, but it had also many potential suppliers. When it shifted to oil, it had less competition. Oil was not used for coking and probably less for electricity generation than coal, but probably had fewer reliable sources of that oil. Thus, the shift to oil make Japanese military forces more dependent on foreign supply or less.
Oh, definitely. So, so in terms of the last question, it made the Japanese military much more dependent on these sort of foreign sources, but then also inspired attempts to develop, you know, these alternative liquid sort of forms of liquid fuel, such as shale oil or synthetic petroleum, and so the Navy is one of the Navy's one of the biggest actors on this front, and it's the main actor that is sort of bringing Mantetsu, for instance, the South Central Railway Company, to the table to discuss the sort of development of some of these industries, such as shale oil production, which doesn't exist anywhere else this was, you know, Japan's first shale oil industry, but so actually, I mean, the sort of military sort of munition production, though, still relied very heavily on coal, and then starts over the course of the war to I mean, perhaps expectedly take up a bigger slice of the sort of coal consumption pie, and this results in a couple of measures that oftentimes falls onto the sort of civilian consumption, to sort of cutting back on civilian consumption. So something we see in Korea, but also in Manchuria, this and then back in the Japanese home islands, this promotion of, let's say, low temperature living, Teon Seikatsu, which is basically or you know, the cutting of bathhouse hours, that you can only the bathhouses can only open at noon, and all these other, so the competition still sort of existed, in part because this coal is being sort of funneled off to you know, munitions production and the like, and another thing that maybe I'll bring up here that is in terms of sort of unintended consequences that resulted in sort of an escalation of consumption of competition on this front, at least in the Manchurian case, is that in Manchuria, for heating prior to this period, there was, I mean, a lot of households, in order to heat, their sort of elevated sort of bed, the kang had used things like sorghum stalks. But with the widespread expansion of the soybean industry, that sort of moved, that turned a lot of this sorghum land into soybean cultivation land, and folks started pivoting to coal, which was also sort of had its price suppressed in order to encourage industrial application. But then because of this, industrial consumers were also competing with sort of household use. And so that's, I mean, I thought was another sort of interesting kind of competition that emerges from this as well.
Great, no, it's super interesting. The next question comes from Niccolo Pianciola, and he asks, to what extent did concessions abroad, or were concessions abroad important for Japan's coal and oil consumption during the 1920s? And he's particularly referring to the Goto Shinbe speech you mentioned. He asks, where were the most important concessions located in terms of production for the Japanese needs, and did their existence influence Japan's foreign policy in the period? And he just adds to that to say that, I mean, he's not sort of talking about areas with direct Japanese control. So those Korea, Southern Manchuria, that the Mantetsu, the Southern Manchurian Railway, directly controlled, but rather indirect control.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. So, I mean, the most famous attempt to secure, so on the oil front, at least, the most famous failed attempt, which at least many Japanese planners in the 20s would sort of cite as a reason for why greater state involvement in these processes would be necessary, was actually Mexico. Japan was very intent on sort of establishing a bunch of Japanese boosters for the oil industry, was very interested in setting up a concession in Mexico, and it fell through in the last minute. But one important one, which I mean, I think it's more along the lines of sort of not entirely occupied territory, but required military force, is the one in sort of northern Sakhalin. So Japan occupies the southern half of Sakhalin. I mean, they call it Karafto, and there's a lot of mining, coal mining that takes place there. That becomes quite internally used, primarily because it becomes because the area is locked with sea ice for half the year. But then there's Japan fights against the Soviet Union and pushes momentarily in the 20s into northern Sakhalin, and then secures an oil concession that it continues to hold until the end of the war. So that was I think would be one of its, on the oil front, the major concession. In terms of other coal ones, then I would be thinking of the ones in North China, especially in let's say Shandong province. You have Luda, for instance, which is the famous sort of Sino-Japanese coal mining firm that Tim Wright has written about. But so and let me see. But that's just identification. You asked actually another question. Okay, these were where they were located. How did they influence Japanese foreign policy in the period? This is so. I mean, with regard to the Soviet Union, I think that was the skirmish or that they had was one thing. yeah, I have to give this a little bit more of I've been thinking a little bit more with the places under sort of formal control, but in relation to sort of not so much feeding the Japanese home markets as sort of sale on other markets. So, for instance, after the Mukden incident, the boycotts that followed of Japanese products, including Japanese coal, which resulted then in sort of these colonial coal being dumped on Japanese industries back in the home islands, and then sparking a whole bunch of minor protests there. But a kind of political economy point that emerges a little bit after this episode is once the boycotts are lifted and manchukuo is declared established, Chiang Kai-shek's government refused to recognize manchukuo for the period of its existence. But in terms of on the taxation front, that's where they recognized it as of a foreign import. So that was one of the, it's just a little side thing, but I thought it was quite interesting. It was profitable for them to recognize it as and tax it accordingly.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I threw that point in for Hassan. I threw that in for your benefit, Hassan.
Yes, please. Yeah. The next question comes from Professor Mire Koikari, and she asks about a question about gender. So she says, it seems that these pronouncements about technology, fuel, and expansion seem to have a lot to do with the ideas and ideals of manliness and masculinity. How much did these techno elites, Goto Shinbe and others, consciously use the talk of fuel extraction and technological innovation to articulate their visions of quote-unquote petro-masculinity? Were they different from other visions of masculinity, soldiering masculinity, and so on, that was circulating at the time in Japan?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I really appreciate that. And I think, to me, in regard to fuel, one of the interesting things is the recognition that it sort of stretches, at least with and this is where the fuel question becomes it tends to conflate a whole bunch of things together. So it's not only it's oftentimes really about coal or only really about oil, but then it collapses these categories all under this rubric of fuel. But then the focus on the home and the focus on the role of the very the wise housewife who's able to sort of conserve fuel on literally the home front in order to sort of serve the war efforts. The war, a lump of coal saved in the home can somehow be channeled to further more national ends is one. Something that's interesting, because I guess for these even these fuel society engineers and many of them were trained primarily as engineers. They all came from that kind of Todai mining engineering lineage. Was that they oftentimes like to evoke this idea of the household, and they talk about cooking and fuel as part of a way to sort of relieve the pressures on the fuel question, the like. And so I'll have to, and so that would be my sort of main response to that. That is
right, thank you. If there are any other questions, please, as before, submit them through the Q&A. I probably have a question I want to ask a bit more about. I'm still sort of very fascinated by the Nenryo Kyokai, the fuel society. And I wonder whether you can say a bit more about who exactly these people actually were and what their connection, whether there were different factions within that society. I suppose if there's competition between different kinds of fossil fuel and energy sources, that might have been reflected in the society as well. And also what exactly their connection or their networks with government elites actually were. You obviously have the Goto Shinbe example, but I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about that.
Could I jump in, because I have almost exactly the same question for Victor? I'm very curious about this society. I mean, do you see it as something like a think tank, that kind of, a group of scientists trying to provide policy-related suggestions to the government, or were they simply mouthpiece of the government, or what they do just justify the action of the imperial government? I mean, and what became of them after the war? I'm very interested in this. Like Ghassan.
Sure. Yeah, I'll love to talk about them. I mean, it's a really fascinating society, and I believe it still exists. And so many of them were sort of initial. So the early members were associated with the Fuel Research Institute. So that's a government body, and whereby it was common to, I mean, like, for instance, Yoshimura was both the director of the Nenryo Kenkyu-jo, and as well as the sort of president of the Nenryo Kyokai at its formation. But you also, I mean, it feels almost predictable, but you also have like admirals being like president of the society. So it becomes, I mean, it brings together a whole bunch of like fuel researchers, some of them associated with the government body, but a number of them like I also mentioned Naito Yu, who was a chemist, had worked with Tokyo Gas. He was an independent researcher. And some of them were college professors. Like, there were a bunch of Nenryo Kyokai guys who were involved in the Shale Oil development project. I mean, they were like, card-holding members of Nenryo Kyokai. So it's almost like, the AAS, if anything, but they were seconded to the military. So they were professors at various universities, but represented the more technical side of the Navy and Army's discussions with Mantetsu. Although the Navy also had its own sort of technically trained experts, many of whom were operating out of Tokuyama, the fuel depot. And one sort of long-term guy who's, a really interesting figure is this person, Nizutani Kotaro, who was involved in, who was basically seconded to Mantetsu, but seemed to have spent like over a decade or more than a decade and a half there, helping with both shale oil production, and then subsequently when they were sort of spent pouring more effort into coal liquefaction and also involved in that enterprise as well. So they're like industry, military, government researchers. Those were and then a lot, and then like academia. So it's sort of that, the military industrial academic complex, like crystallized into this one agency.
Interesting.
Did they ever propose policies or technology that contradicted the government, or they always went along with government policy?
Well, I think they were trying to make make the government recognize a concrete fuel policy. And actually, I mean, while there was going to be an oil law and a coal law, like the vision of a much more self-controlled fuel policy that many of them had been drafting and discussing over those decades never really came to pass. But for instance, they would go to the government and ask for the establishment of a setting aside of funds for an investigative and prospecting bureau, and then maybe after 2 years the government might set it up, but then put it in some other hands, some other agency. So this was this was it didn't seem to me like a place where the kind of resistance happened. If anything, this is a place where, I mean, one of the arguments I didn't sort of mention, I tried to cover too much ground, so I didn't manage to like really dwell on this a little bit more. But I think it's almost like in identifying the problem and then like harping on it and then saying that they have all the solutions to it, they like created that sense of what the problem itself was. I mean, not to say that, some of these industries or the military didn't desire greater volumes of these resources, but to the extent in which it becomes kind of almost endemic to kind of pre-war Japanese conditions, then this was I think
so I suppose I suppose it was dissolved after the war.
Oh, it's still around.
It's still around. Okay.
Yeah. Well, talking now a lot more about nuclear and green energy and all the like. I've not read too far into their post-war journals, but it's such became it's sort of the most I mean, to me, at least, for when I'm talking about it in terms of my Japan chapters in the book, and I mean, the book has a lot more on China also, and back between these, but it was almost like the clearest instantiation of what I think of as carbon technocracy. This is the brain thrust of carbon technocracy.
Wonderful, yeah. So yeah, I think unless there are any, is there another question? There is, yeah.
Oh,
so maybe
James
we should we'll take this as a final question from James, James Victor, and he says, Japan 1900 to 1945 is in many ways in a fuel trap. It needs more fuel for an increasingly broad array of users to quote unquote modernize, which modernization and industrialization is necessary for the Japanese state to have a first-tier army and navy, but which uses also consumes the fuel that the military part of the state would need. When, in the first half of the 20th century, does Japan feel less behind, quote unquote, in its acquisition of the fuels it feels it needs at the time? Or does the state see the struggle for fuel perpetually getting worse? Does the 1922 settlement at least let Japan feel like it can meet its needs?
So I mean, I think the story is very different between coal and oil. I think with oil, it is a perpetual problem, and it's a problem that really trickles from military and naval concern that becomes sort of written as a larger societal concern. But with coal, it's interesting because there's actually a glut of coal, especially into the early 1930s. The sort of small and medium-sized coal mines in Japan are hard hit by the Depression. And then this is then compounded by the dumping episodes from colonial coal undercutting domestic producers that send these miners, these thousands of miners out into the streets of Fukuoka to protest against this, and then the Mantetsu gets a small slap on the hand, and then so the big coal producers also get a slap on the hand. But one of the things here that I found interesting, so I mean, there's also the issue about varieties of coal. So Japan has a lot of coal. Japan doesn't have a lot of coking coal. So that's one of the things it sort of imports, especially it had imported from the colonies, including those the mines it held in southern Manchuria. But one of the interesting things I found is, I mean, it's kind of consistent with a sort of boosterism, but many of these folks who were involved in the fuel industry and speaking through, let's say, the Ninryokai, were very willing to like slip very quickly from, oil problem. It's actually a bigger like fuel problem that's also a coal problem, and we should have more of this stuff. And all these foolish miners out in the streets, like, I mean, they are not thinking in big picture. We think about big picture and more anticipatory problems. It's not a present problem of like glut. It's this like future in which we have, our country only has like 0.2% of like coal in the United States. This is it becomes this kind of acquisitive, sort of productivist mindset that clamps into. I mean, to me, that is where the imaginary lies. I mean, it's much more clearly part of a sense of almost a sort of creation of a sociological creation of a problem rather than the immediate material constraints. So that's a moment, I think, that I would say that Japan was, for the needs of its society at that time, was pretty comfortable with the amount of coal it had, but a lot of folks didn't think so. But thank you for the question,
thank you.
James.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think we are slowly running out of time, and we probably don't want to keep you even longer, given how late it's already in the States. But I don't know whether Professor Leung might want to conclude.
Thank you so much, Victor, for this great talk and very inspiring talk. And we really look forward to reading your book. And I've been thinking, with Ghassan working on electricity in China, and we have recently recruited a student who is going to work on solar energy. And with you on fuel and coal and oil, and maybe we can do something together on energy, the history of energy provision. I think, in a sense, when I was listening to your talk, I keep thinking that food is part of the question. It provides energy to humans, and so maybe we can do something together. And this is really a field with great potential, and so hopefully, with the passing of the COVID, we can meet and have some more discussions for future plans. Yeah. So thank you so much, Victor. And
thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, everybody.
So much, to everyone for coming. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Angela, Hassan. This was really great fun. And if anyone has any other questions here, please feel free to email me. I'd love to sort of take up your questions too.
Yes. Okay, I think you should take some rest now.
Yeah. Take care. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Ciao.